3, 2, 1, let's go. Hi everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Boring JavaScript. I'm your host, the Virtuoid, aka Mike Smith, and today we're going to talk about the fetch object. Now, what is the fetch object? Well, it does exactly what the name says. It fetches resources, especially if you're fetching resources over a network. Now, you may remember the old XML HTTP request object. Great, wonderful little device to be able to access resources off the internet. But the fetch object takes that and wraps it around this glorious API that makes it much, much easier to use. And today, I'm going to show you some very simple ways of using the fetch object to be able to grab both HTML and JSON data. Let's take a look. Now, the fetch object is used inside browsers. So to be able to show you the examples, I need an HTML file. And this is my HTML file here. It's a very simple little file that when I click on a particular button, I want it to populate this list. And that's it. There's nothing else. In fact, this is what it looks like. You can see there's nothing there. So let's take a look at the JavaScript behind that. First of all, before anything else, obviously I have to get an event listener to the click button to execute a certain function. And this function is get the list. And it's when they get the list that we have the fetch object and the magic that occurs here. Here is the fetch. Now the fetch takes two arguments. I'm just using one here for this simple example. The first argument is the URL to be able to get. Now I've got a local web server here and I'm getting a file called animals.json. In fact, it looks like that. Real simple array of objects. The second argument, which I don't show you here, is an argument of all the different options you can pass to it. And this is where fetch shines. If you need to do cores, if you need to do a post, a get, a delete, a head, anything with that you can normally do with a HTML type request, this is where you will specify. It's within the second argument. And of course, I just want a simple get HTTP get, URL. The thing is, though, is that you have to remember is that fetch returns a promise. Now, promises are way beyond this particular edition of Boring JavaScript. You'll have to read up on that later. But suffice it to say that when it returns a promise, I'm going to then give it a list of different options it will do once that promise is satisfied. And what I mean by a satisfied promise is that once it completes the operation of reading in the URL, in this case animals.json. The first thing I want it to do is I want it to process the response. Now, the response that comes back from a fetch is a raw HTTP response object, not formatted, not nothing. It doesn't know JSON from HTML, from text, from a blob, from anything. You're the one that has to tell it what to do. But since a lot of the operations are going to be getting text, like HTML, or it's going to be getting JSON, it has given you two convenience methods to be able to convert automatically. And I'm using one of them here. I am taking the response, this function here, and I am returning the JSON value of that response. Now I know in this case it's going to be JSON, so I'm just using the convenience. Can you do anything? Of course you can. The then takes a function, and that function you can do absolutely anything you want to with the response. After that happens, because that's going to return a promise too, we then do a display. And this display is very, very simple. It just sits there and just loops through all of them and gives me the type of the animal and adds that to the UL that we have created there. Finally, if there ever happens to be any kind of error, we have to do some sort of error catching. And this is where the whoops return comes in. It is called by the catch statement. And I will just print out there. And we'll kind of show you that just a little bit later on here. We don't really, use that at this particular point in time. So you want to see it in action? Let's take a quick look. We go over to here, click me to get a list of animals. And there we go. It read my JSON file, and there's my list of animals. So that's how you can use the fetch to very simply and very quickly get JSON data from any URL to which you have access. Now, earlier I said that you could get JSON data, HTML data, text data, and I showed you exactly how to get JSON. Well, how do you get HTML? Well, that's extraordinarily easy too. So let's take a look at the HTML I'm going to use for this particular example. I now have two buttons on the screen, one for click to get the type and one for clicking to get the name. I still have the same div here for the list, and I've got a new JavaScript. So the idea here is I now have two snippets. This first one called animalnames.html, which is a snippet of ULLI, is real simple, and animaltypes.html, which again is a simple listing of ULLI listing. Let's take a look at the JavaScript behind it. Of course, I've got the same event listeners for all the different click buttons here, and here is my new getList function, which now takes a argument for what particular resource we're going to get. The two different event listeners will either go to this function or this function, which will pass the different name of the snippets. So the change in the fetch statement occurs right here. And again, remember, the response you get from the fetch is always an HTTP response object. It's very raw data. And I used the JSON convenience method to be able to convert to JSON. I'm now using the text convenience method to convert it to text. And why text, not HTML? Well, HTML is nothing more than just simple text. That's it. So the idea here is that I've grabbed the response, I've now converted it to text. I now have a text string of HTML. And what do you do with a text string of HTML? Well, you set the inner HTML to that text string. That's it. Real simple, real quick here. So again, once I do a click up here, I either go to this function to get the animal names, or I get to this function to get the animal types. That will pass the name of the file to my getTheList, which will pass it to the fetch. The fetch will convert it to text, send it to the display, and the display will simply set the inner HTML. Let's take a look and see what happens. Here's my example. I click to get a list of animal types, and there we are. There's my animal types. Well, how about animal names? Well, we click there, now we get the animal names. And since we're replacing the inner HTML, it is erasing the old one and doing the new one. So we can flip all day long between the two and keep changing it. So that is how you can get HTML snippets from your network by using the fetch statement. So how do you handle errors in the fetch object? Well, it's very simple to be able to do, and I'm going to show you the very quick example on how that works. I've gone back to my original HTML file where we did the JSON, and I'm going to change this to a new JavaScript file. Response. And this new JavaScript file is going to handle the fetch just a little bit differently. This is what it's going to do. So let's go to the fetch response JavaScript. Again, I have the event listener up there. I have everything exactly the same as it was before, including the get list, but notice there's one important change, and that is the response. No longer am I using the convenience response.json or response.text here. I've wrote my own function. And within this function here, I am now going to be checking the response of the HTTP request that I made. So again, remember, the fetch is going to return to you an HTTP response. And I'm going to check the status of that response. If it is not 200, and I'm not going to explain what all the different codes are, you can look at it later. But if it is not 200, I'm going to throw a new error and give it this particular error message. If it is a 200, I'm going to return the response.json, just like we've always had before. And I'm going to return a resolved promise because I've got to return a promise, basically, from this particular response. So why am I just throwing an error here instead of doing a promise resolve like I'm doing down here? Well, the reason I'm throwing a new error is that will automatically reject a promise. Going back up here, this will execute all these different statements in order as long as everything is okay. So it's going to fetch, and if the fetch was okay, it's going to do the fetch response. And if the fetch response was okay, it's going to do the display, and that's it. The catch statement is used if there's any type of errors, or what we call a rejected promise. So when I throw an error down here, it automatically becomes a rejected promise. So what I should expect if this error is out is for it to go to the whoops function. And the whoops function, as you can tell here, just prints out a quick little error message into that list. So let's take a look and see how this runs. So if we go back to our example here, of course, as you know, it does actually work. But now let's make it bomb. So I'm going to go to the animals.json here, and I'm going to call it animalsbad.json. And there is no such a file called animalsbad.json. So let's go back now to our example. Let's do a refresh and click to get list of animals. Whoops, there we go. Now I knew it was going to give a 404 error because 404 errors are always given if it can't find the resource. So this is a way that you can use to be able to use the fetch statement and detect errors and create your own type of error messages and your own recovery from those particular error messages. Real simple, real quick, very convenient. And that's all there is on the fetch statement today. I hope you enjoyed our video. Hope I didn't bore you to death. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check out our blog at thevirtuoid.wordpress.com or check out more videos at www.boringjavascript.com. Thanks again, and we'll see you later.